record-breaking heat. Much of the Northern Hemisphere is experiencing withering high temperatures, which scientists warn are increasingly likely to continue. An increasingly deep dive among Democrats in Congress about how strongly or even whether to support Israel has reared its head on the eve of a visit by the nation's president to Washington, as progressives openly condemn the Jewish state and others toil to reconcile their backing for the country with disdain for its current government. The rift burst into public view over the weekend when Representative Jayapal, a Washington Democrat who leads the Congressional Progressive Caucus, said at a conference that Israel, quote, is a racist state, quote, leading to a swift condemnation from House Democratic leaders that prompted her to walk back the comment. Former South African President Nelson Mandela goes from hero to scapegoat as South Africa struggles. Mr. Mandela's image, which the ANC has plastered across the country, has for some shifted that of hero to scapegoat. Now, 10 years after his death, attitudes are starting to change. The party Mr. Mandela led after his release from prison, the African National Congress, is in serious danger of losing its outright majority for the first time since he became president in 1994 in the first re-election after the fall of apartheid. Some blame the ANC of corruption, ineptitude, and elitism, which they say have tarnished the party's reputation. On Friday, Iowa's Republican governor signed a strict abortion ban into law. And for 3 days, most abortions in Iowa were illegal past 6 weeks of pregnancy. Until Monday afternoon, when a district court judge in Polk County said that the new ban would be suspended while the larger legal case against it moved forward. Kerry Kennedy, a sister of Democratic presidential campaign Robert F. Kennedy Jr., lambasted her brother in a brief statement yesterday after a report quoted him as saying that COVID-19 was, quote, targeted to attack Caucasians and Black people, end of quote, and that Jewish people were somehow most immune. Well, the Michigan Attorney General announced felony charges this afternoon against 16 people in a case involving Trump supporters' attempt to overturn the 2020 election results in Michigan by convening a false slate of electoral college electors. Each of the 16 defendants has been charged with 8 felony counts, including forgery and conspiracy to commit forgery for allegedly signing documents attesting falsely that they were Michigan's duly elected and qualified electors for president and vice president. You are listening and watching Areva Martin in real time, and I'm your host, Areva Martin. This is your one-stop destination for today's trending news, expert analysis, and my unfiltered opinions. We are in hour 2 of Areva Martin in real time, and this is the hour where we dig deeper, where we go behind the headlines and bring you the stories that people are talking about and the experts and sometimes everyday people who really know what's happening with regards to those stories. Today, we're talking about who really benefited from slavery and free slave labor in the United States. So we've all seen the movies, we've read articles, we've seen books, and we probably have been told narratives about white slave and plantation owners, mostly in the South. And many of us have been led to believe that those plantation owners were the exclusive beneficiaries of slavery, and that somehow folks in the North, businesses, institutions, religious organizations in the North were somehow unconnected, unrelated to the slave trade and the massive amount of revenue that it created. Well, my guests today are going to debunk those myths. Both have written articles and books about the true beneficiaries of the U.S. slave trade. And some of their findings are going to shock you, and in some cases, make you lose your religion. When you think about who are the true beneficiaries of slavery and what those beneficiaries have or have not done to compensate not only the enslaved, but the descendants of slaves. This is a part of the continuing dialogue and conversation we're having about reparations. We've been talking for the last couple of months about reparations efforts around this country, particularly those that I'm involved in Palm Springs, California, those efforts that are taking place in the state of California and others, even in places like St. Louis, Missouri. People all over this country are starting to look at the ways in which property and land and free labor was stolen from Black people, and really asking the question, how do we make the descendants of slaves whole? How do we address the pervasive racism that has resulted in the taking, the unlawful, the unjustified taking of Black land and property? When we come forward, two of the nation's leading experts on race and capitalism and the taking of property, particularly the use of slave labor to fund some of your probably favorite and most cherished institutions in this country. Stay with us right here on KBLA Talk 1580. You are listening and watching Areva Martin in real time, and I'm your host, Areva Martin. This is hour 2 of the show, and this is the hour where we dig deep on stories that folks are talking about. We all recall that after George Floyd's murder in May of 2020, America started having a reckoning with its founding narrative, its origin story, and really the role that race has played in terms of how folks are situated in this country, specifically how we are situated with respect to economics. A big bright spotlight was shined on the gross disparities in terms of wealth between Black folks in this country and white folks, and the ever growing wealth gap, and what some of the causes of that wealth gap are. And you can't have that conversation about the wealth gap or about America's founding narrative or its origin story without talking about slavery. And so today we're talking about the beneficiaries of the U.S. slave trade. And joining me in this hour is New York University professor Rachel Swarns. She's also the author of a new book called The 272, The Families Who Were Enslaved and Sold to Build the American Catholic Church. Also in this hour, a history of slavery, capitalism, and African American inequality. Professor at Arizona State University, Calvin Schermerhorn, is here. He is the author of 4 books on the history of slavery in the U.S., including Unrequited Toil, A History of United States Slavery. Welcome to both of you, Professor Swarns and Professor Schermerhorn. I guess I wanted to start the show by talking about the narrative that most people have been fed, which is that the U.S. slave trade benefited primarily the white plantation owners and slave owners who were in the South. And you know, we have all been kind of misled into believing that there weren't other beneficiaries of slavery. Both of you, in your research and the articles and books that you have written, debunk that myth. And for you, Professor Swarns, your book really brings home the point about the Catholic Church and universities, private universities, being, two of the biggest categories of beneficiaries of slavery. Talk to us about 272, the families who were enslaved and sold to build the American Catholic Church. Why did you write the book, and what was one of the most shocking revelations you found in your research for the book?
Well, I stumbled across this history. It was not something that I was familiar with, and I always like to say the best way for me to introduce people to it is to tell you a little bit about who the 272 were. And to do that, I need to take you back, all of our listeners tonight, take you back to November of 1838 to the docks in Alexandria, Virginia, not far from where the nation's capital is now. And if you had been there on the docks that day, you would have seen them. Scores of people being loaded onto a ship, forcibly loaded. There were elderly people, husbands and wives, children, babies. These were African Americans who were being sold and shipped down south, far from the people they loved and the world that they knew. And they had been enslaved and sold by some of the nation's most prominent Catholic priests, who happened at the time to be among the largest slaveholders in Maryland. And when tough times came, these priests did what a lot of people did, which was to sell off their assets. And in this instance, those assets were human property, 272 men, women, and children. And they sold these folks because they were trying to save their biggest mission project, which happened to be the nation's first Catholic institution of higher learning, the college we now know as Georgetown University. And I've got to say, this was astounding to me. I consider myself a fairly educated person. This was not news to historians, as you'll hear. But many of us think about, I certainly did, I happen to be Catholic myself. Many of us think about the Catholic Church as a northern institution, right? As an immigrant church. But slavery was foundational to the emergence of the church. And I was stunned that Catholic priests had owned and sold people, and I wanted to know more about that, and I wanted to know more about those families.
And so in the book, you actually follow a family through, I'm reading here, 2 centuries of indentured servitude and enslavement. Tell us a little about that family.
Right. You know, a lot of people, I think about when we think about slavery, we think about something long, long ago, not connected to us, and these faceless, nameless people. And I wanted to make this real for people. And so I focused on one family, starting with the matriarch, a woman by the name of Anne Joyce, who arrives in Maryland in the 1600s, a Black woman who was an indentured servant. Her contract is burned. She's forced into slavery. She's lost everything that she has, except for her story. And she passes her story on to her children and grandchildren, generation to generation. Our liberty was stolen. We should have been free people. And her descendants resist. Some descendants, 2 descendants, kill an overseer and are executed. Some of her descendants take the Catholic priests to court. They sue them to try to get their liberty. Some are successful, but some are not. And one descendant by the name of Harry Mahoney saves the church's wealth in the War of 1812 and garners a promise from the priest that his family will never be sold. But that promise is broken in 1838 with that mass sale of the 272.
Wow. Were you able to find and talk to any of the descendants of the Mahoney family?
Yes, and that's one of the things that's been most important to me in my work, is to show not only the history and how slavery fueled the growth of many of our contemporary institutions, but how we live with this history, how we grapple with it as families and as institutions. And I tell the story of 2 contemporary descendants who learn of this history after I wrote a story for the New York Times in 2016. They become part of a movement to press Georgetown and the Jesuits to address and atone for this history. And one of those descendants happened to be an employee of Georgetown at the time, and still is.
Wow. So Dr. Schermerhorn, Dr. Swarns says that this was shocking to her. She learned this history. She said historians have known it, and that would be you. You're a historian. You've studied this throughout your career. Help us understand, put this in context for us. How unique, if at all, is the story that Dr. Swarns tells about the Catholic Church in Georgetown?
Well, I think Professor Swarns' research has amplified something that historians have known a little bit about, but haven't known that much about. And these revelations have come very recently. So the Georgetown revelation is less than 10 years old. And the revelation about Johns Hopkins, the supposed abolitionist who enslaved at least 4 people in his own household, that was just 3 years ago. And so historians really haven't done the hard work of getting those receipts for that history the way that we're supposed to. I think the person that really broke this was Professor Craig Stephen Wilder with a book, Ebony and Ivy, that went in and looked at the connections between slavery and universities. And in 2006, Brown University came out with a report on its history, saying that institution, that Ivy League school, was heavily indebted for its existence to the proceeds from the transatlantic slave trade. And so each time we put a microscope on this situation, we see more and more. So when Harvard, faculty at Harvard looked into that institution's history, they found that Harvard had owned enslaved people, and enslaved people had worked there. There's a book coming out early next year by Yale historian David Blight, exposing Yale's long and deep association with American slavery. But I want to take this in just a slightly different direction. And that is that, what do institutions of higher education, what do they have to do with this institution, and how do they relate to it? We go back into the early part of the 19th century, when Georgetown is doing the things that Professor Swarns is describing. They're not alone. Many other institutions now, especially in the South, like the University of Virginia, the University of Mississippi, owned and used enslaved people. But this wasn't limited to the South. nor was it limited to just owning enslaved people. If you look at the production of knowledge, what were the institutions of higher education saying about race? We can go up to Harvard, look at Louis Agassiz, founder of the American School of Ethnography, who put forth a theory of polygenesis, that Black people were separately created than white people. And so here's a Harvard professor that is giving a scientific basis for racism, and he certainly wasn't alone. We think of the sort of the culture wars description of higher education today, which is a bunch of liberal elites kind of controlling the narrative around race and culture. That absolutely wasn't the case in the 19th century. Most U.S. institutions of higher education were reinforcing and perpetuating the racial status quo.
Wow. Yeah, thank you for that history and mentioning Harvard, which I'm an alumni of Harvard. How many, do you know, Professor Swarns, how many of these private and some public institutions, who have a similar history to the history that, you've talked about with respect to Georgetown, we now know with respect to Brown University and others? Do we have any sense about the numbers?
There is actually an organization now, a consortium, as you might call it, of universities that are studying this history, and there are at least 90 of them, I believe, that have they've banded together, and they are committed to studying and trying to address their institution's roots in slavery. It's I want to talk about the church again for a second, just so people understand the scale. Priests who enslaved people and sold people established the nation's first archdiocese, built the nation's first cathedral, the first Catholic institution of higher learning, Georgetown, as we know, as I mentioned. Priests who operated a plantation and sold people established the first Catholic seminary. So it's foundational, but it's important to know not just Georgetown, not just universities, not just the Catholic Church, not just religious organizations. We're talking about banks. We're talking about, insurance companies. This was foundational to the economy. So as Professor Schermerhorn says, if you look closely, you'll find it. And the truth is that we haven't, as a society, wanted to look very closely, and that's been part of the problem.
And I was going to ask you, Professor Schermerhorn, how come there hasn't been more research by historians, Black or white, on the relationship of these prominent institutions to slavery?
Well, I think it's in part because of what you started with. We have a certain narrative about the founding. We have a certain narrative about who we are as a people. And that narrative seems to treat freedom and slavery like oil and water. That once you have a nation founded on the principles of liberty, that somehow slavery is inimical to that, is antithetical. But as we dig deeper, we see that freedom and slavery were more like built on one another rather than like oil and water. And what I mean by that is that in order for there to be like this real consciousness of freedom in the United States, a lot of the founders and a lot of the people who maintain that government were enslavers, and they knew very intimately what the value of freedom because they deprived others of it. And then if we want to go and dig deeper, I think as Professor Swarns has indicated, if you look at the way the economics works, this is kind of common sense to us today. If you go into a store and make a purchase, yes, it seems to be a local event if it happens in Los Angeles or where I'm sitting in Tempe, Arizona. Or if we look at slavery, maybe that's something that happened on a plantation in the South. But if we use our credit card, that links that transaction to a bank. And so by the same token, enslavers needed a lot of credit. they needed a lot of support. They needed a lot of infrastructure. So something that seems localized in the South that happens in a field is actually linked to a financial center in New York or Liverpool or wherever the kind of that financial chain leads, or whatever that supply chain leads. And so the more we've looked, the more we've discovered that the financial transactions that seem to be localized in the South lead back to those financial centers and to shippers and to manufacturers of tools and clothing and to people who are buying the bonds that are represented by the banks that are in this.
Hold that thought, Professor. When we come forward, I want to talk about, now that we have all this knowledge, particularly around these university churches and other institutions, what are they going to do about it? Stay with us. KBLA Talk 1580. We are back. And in this hour, we're talking about the true beneficiaries of the U.S. chattel slave trade. And it may be shocking to hear that it's not just white plantation owners in the South that benefited from slavery, but it also included big institutions like universities, private and public, and some churches like the Catholic Church. I have experts joining me in this hour, Professor Rachel Swarns, who is the author of a new book called The 272, The Families Who Were Enslaved and Sold to Build the American Catholic Church. And Professor Calvin Schermerhorn is here. He's author of 4 books, including Unrequited Toil, A History of United States Slavery. So, Professor Swarns, the Catholic Church has been exposed. Georgetown has been exposed. I know there's been an effort by some activists to get Georgetown to pay reparations, make amends for its use of slave labor to build that university. But where are we? Where are we with the Catholic Church and Georgetown in terms of their willingness to make descendants of these slave families whole?
Very good question. Georgetown, even before my first article on this ran in April of 2016, Georgetown had established a working group to look into its history and to try to address it. And in September of 2016, the university took some of the first steps, offering preference in admissions to descendants of people who were enslaved and people who were sold, effectively legacy status for those people. They formally changed the names of some buildings and more recently created a fund, what they call a reconciliation fund, where they are committed to raising $400,000 a year to fund projects that benefit descendants and descendant communities. The first $200,000 was allocated toward projects just this semester. As for the Jesuits, they partnered with descendant leaders to create a foundation and committed to raising $100 million toward, again, racial reconciliation projects and projects to benefit descendants. It was a landmark move by the Catholic Church, the largest effort by the Catholic Church to address its history of slaveholding in the United States. But, fundraising has been slower than expected. And in both situations, both with Georgetown and with the Catholic Church, with the Jesuits, descendants who now number at least 6,000 have had mixed feelings about this, with some saying, okay, good first steps, but wanting more.
Hey, when you say fundraising has stalled, who did the Catholic Church expect to raise this money from?
Well, good question. And I shouldn't say stalled. It's been slower than expected. They have been actually going around to Catholic institutions, talking to, schools and alums of high schools, colleges, trying to raise money. Some descendants are kind of offended by even the fundraising notion because they feel like the Catholic Church should just outright, allocate these funds. But, these are the efforts that are in place. And just recently, they've this foundation that I mentioned, which they established in partnership with some descendants, is going to be working to establish scholarships to historically Black colleges and universities too for descendants. So they are taking steps. I should say that these are, as I mentioned, with the Catholic Church and with Georgetown too. I mean, they are notable. Georgetown was among the first major universities to take such a step in terms of offering legacy status. to folks. And as I mentioned, the church's, the Jesuits' decision was also a landmark. But again, even so, some descendants are saying more should be done.
Yeah, I know in the case, Dr. Schermerhorn, with respect to Harvard, I was pretty disappointed when I learned that Harvard's efforts, they were going to put aside $100 million. There were going to be some projects done. You know, they were going to also change some names of buildings. Help us understand what real, recompense would look like, because it just seems like these multi-billion-dollar institutions like Georgetown, like Harvard, $100 million to them is a drop in the bucket. And yes, that's why I ask you, Professor Swarns, who is the Catholic Church expecting to raise this money from? Like, so you said schools and other institutions. So they're going to, my kid's Catholic school asking us to give money that's already underfunded. So that seems a little ridiculous to me. What am I missing here, Professor Schermerhorn?
I don't think you're missing anything. It's this reluctance to grapple with the realities of historical injustice and also to do that historical accounting. If we go back and think about how the kind of how this works, if my triple great grandparent profited off this system, and I have inherited a portion of that, I've materially benefited from that. By the same token, if my triple X grandparent was enslaved and was essentially robbed of the fruits of their labor, those debts are still on the books, on the moral books. And so the efforts to kind of take that moral historical accounting and do something with it often gets kind of put into symbolic forms, right? Let's rename a building. Let's rename a college or something like that. And so you've got, institutions like the Virginia Theological Seminary that created a $1.7 million fund to fund scholarships for relatives of descendants of people that enslaved and others. And Princeton Theological Seminary came up with $27 million for something similar. This is, okay, that's institutional, and that's kind of focused on the people who are descended from those who were enslaved or connected to those people. The Virginia House of Representatives, this is interesting, in 2021 passed a bill that covered 5 public universities in Virginia that would give scholarships to, and I don't want to say give, that would award scholarships to the descendants or their communities of those 5 public Virginia institutions that were involved in slavery. Now, that didn't become law because it died in the Virginia House. I'm sorry, the Virginia Senate. But I think what would be more pertinent are some of the suggestions put forth by scholars like William A. Sandy Darity, who suggests loan forgiveness for African American students. And that's not just based on kind of reaching, for just a moral argument. We look at African American students carry a higher proportional debt load, or higher, in many cases, higher absolute debt load than white and Latino students. And so if we want to get serious about that moral accounting, we actually have to do something, and that should be public funded. That should be a debt that's not just assumed by a particular institution or church, but more broadly shared as we share in that history.
Yeah, when we come forward, I want to talk about resistance, because I mentioned the reparations actions that are happening around the country. California, its 1,000-page reparations report. But consistently, when the question of reparations is polled, it polls really, really low. Lots of opposition to the concept of repair, restorative justice, or making restitution to descendants of slaves. And it's puzzling to me when we have all of these receipts. And so I want to talk about some of the arguments we hear from those who oppose making any kind of restitution for folks who are the descendants of slaves when we come forward on KBLA Talk 1580. So, Professor Schermerhorn, help us understand why the polling on any kind of reparations related to slavery or the enslavement of African Americans in this country, why does it poll so low? And why does there seem to be so much opposition against any kind of restitution for descendants of slaves?
I think most white Americans don't want to confront this history. And I think it's part willful, willful ignorance, if you like, but also profound misunderstanding. Again, we have these narratives of not only the founding, but the general arc of American history. And that seems to exonerate the sort of the present generation for past injustices. And so we think, oh, because there was emancipation, well, that kind of wipes the debt off the books. You can listen to Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural speech that if the wealth piled up by 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and every drop of blood drawn by the lash will be repaid by another drawn by the sword. There it is. He's saying, oh, reparations is done. This is not true. And this is not something that we have confronted as a nation. The way that, say, Germany has confronted its, Nazi past, we have not made ourselves confront that. There's also a profound misunderstanding and, again, kind of a willful ignorance when you talk about something like the racial wealth gap. There was a study done in 2019 that polled white Americans, and the results were astounding. Most of those polled believed that the racial wealth gap was 10 to 9. That is, for every $10 the typical white American family had, African American families had $9, when actually it was 10 to 1. And so we have to confront those misunderstandings. We also have to reframe the narrative as well. It's not about saying, well, my ancestors weren't here, white ancestors weren't here in the 1840s, and therefore I'm not responsible. Because I think we've well established that the wages of whiteness is privilege, is remuneration, it's wealth, it's income. And to the extent that we just surrender and say, oh, this is impossible, then we've given up the project. So we have to reiterate this history, and we have to kind of make these stories tangible and palpable in the way that Professor Swarns has done with the 272.
Yeah, and so what kind of opposition have you received, if any, Professor Swarns, and how do you address what Professor Schermerhorn is saying? I'm involved in a case that I'll call reparations like in Palm Springs, California. And what I often hear from some of those that are opposing the matter is, we didn't do it. That was long ago. The people who really suffered are dead. So why should you, the descendant, be benefited because you didn't suffer the harm? How do you respond to those kinds of responses?
They're very, very typical, unfortunately. I would say that the good news is that we're in a moment where institutions, municipalities, right, are all around the country, taking a different tack, saying, no, we need to look at our history. We need to address this history of slavery. There's a lot of experimentation that's going on. And this is happening, though, of course, at the same time that history has become a battleground, right? You have states and politicians around the country banning books and resisting efforts to teach on some of these subjects. PEN America put out a study, a report looking at books that were banned just in the first half of the 2022-2023 school year, and said there were more than 800 books, individual titles banned, and about a third of those were books about race and racism. And so we are still confronting a situation where folks are reluctant to address this history. I would say, though, that, these descendants give me some hope in that they are, making themselves visible. And certainly, the stories of these people who were enslaved and sold to build the church are coming out. My book is a part of that. And I think that people are trying to make it known and make it clear.
Well, yes and no. I guess I would say I agree and disagree, because what I'm seeing is this is breaking down, Professor Schermerhorn, along political lines. So you have a blue state like California, where a Democratic legislature had the guts to enact legislation to create a reparations task force to study California's role, even though we were not a slave state. But obviously, the Black folks in California have suffered because of Jim Crow type policies and other discriminatory policies. And then you have the legislative body and elected officials in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who are trying to even rewrite the Tulsa race massacre and say it wasn't about race. I mean, literally, the superintendent of education in Tulsa, is trying to rewrite that entire narrative. And you have representatives in states like Texas who are trying to pass laws that would punish municipalities in the state of Texas that even, enter into any kind of agreements with descendants of slaves to pay reparations. So this issue of restitution, reparations, grappling with Americans' origin story now is a part of the culture war. So where does that leave us?
The political situation is bleak, but these measures are actually admissions of weakness. If you use concentrated political power to silence people rather than to give a counter argument or try and present the argument with evidence, then you're almost conceding the argument. And I think if we go back to the events that started our conversation, with the consciousness raising around the murder of George Floyd, then we can see that how this is working through the political system. I hope that we can keep focused on the evidence. You cannot even pick up a newspaper from 1921 in Tulsa and not see what that massacre was about. You can't even get past the first few paragraphs of some of the eyewitness accounts without knowing that. And so the way that you can you can square the circle of that event is by forcing silence. And I hope that is not going to work.
Yeah. Are more historians. We also started this conversation by saying a lot of this history, as it relates to churches and universities and big institutions, whether they're banks, insurance companies, et cetera, a lot of that history had not been unearthed. Do you see there being a movement amongst historians to do more of this research, to make more of these findings available?
I certainly do. And I've been encouraged. I've been inspired by Professor Swarns' research. A book that I'm writing is the last chapter is an interview with a descendant of the 272, not just to talk about her ancestors, but the present day and her experience growing up in rural Louisiana and facing the discrimination and overcoming, as much as she can and her family can, the history of this. And I see this in the profession as well. But by the same token, I do see the frontline educators, the grade school, the grade school teachers are very hesitant to try and push against an atmosphere of intimidation.
Yeah, well, I want to thank both of you for the history, the research, the writings, the books, all that you've done to contribute to this narrative, to help change this false narrative, and to really help advance the issues and to provide the kinds of evidence-based research that's needed to establish what America's real history with slavery is and who the real beneficiaries were. Again, it's Professor Rachel Swarns. Her book is called The 272, the families who were enslaved and sold to build the American Catholic Church. And thank you again, Professor Calvin Schermerhorn, who has 4 books, sounds like a 5th coming out. One of his books is Unrequited Toil, A History of United States Slavery. Again, thanks to both of you for joining me. You can follow me on all social media platforms at Areva Martin. And the next voice that you hear will be Robin Ayers and Raw Report right here on KBLA Talk 1580. Don't touch your dial.